Chapter 376, Mr. Harras. In a room filled with the ethereal fragrance of amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine, Capim's henchman, who had been possessed by Klein, was made to chant the fool's honorific name. Amidst the monotonous yet rhythmic murmurs and the fragrance that made it difficult to focus, the man's spirit body gradually dissipated. He became muddle-headed but maintained a certain degree of unusual lucidity, as if he was hypnotizing himself. With Klein's help in his spirit-body form and the feedback from the chanting the fool's honorific name, he slowly entered an artificial sleepwalking state. His astral projection approached the infinitely high gray fog and the mysterious location above the gray fog. Klein seized the opportunity, ended the summoning, and returned to the towering ancient palace, where he sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He saw a bright light circle rippling around him, sketching out the illusory figure of Capim's henchman. The mysterious space was affected by the ritual as it trembled slightly. Some of the energy was being pried away and was slowly flowing. Klein picked up the Black Emperor card, and a paper figurine flashed in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, the paper figurine flew out and absorbed the sliver of energy that had been pried out of the gray fog. It then transformed into a man wearing a black cap and a thick cotton jacket. He looked identical to Capim's henchman. Even his aura and feel was indistinguishable from the real person. This paper figurine overlapped with the target's illusory figure and helped him resist the mysterious and unknown restrictions placed within his spirit body. At the same time, Klein held the Black Emperor card and spread his spirituality, touching the projection of Capim's henchman formed by the pure light. This was one of the applications of secret deeds, where a weak human and a great being were able to be a little in tune with each other, feeling the corresponding knowledge and gaining a wonderful soul-body experience. Unlike normal circumstances, Klein was playing the role of the great being in this instance. In this kind of close, interactive state that belonged to a secret deed, humans could gain knowledge from great existences, and great existences could also naturally use questions to obtain the information they wanted. If it wasn't for Klein's inability to master the field of the mind, he would have been able to plant an inducing suggestion. What kind of powerful people are in Capim's villa? Klein asked through the interactive spirituality state. Without any resistance, the projection transmitted the memories to Klein, making him feel like he was watching a holographic film. The man in the cap stood respectfully and fearfully in the room. In front of him was a middle-aged gentleman in a black tailcoat and a white wig. This gentleman had a long, thin, and stern face, and his mouth was naturally pursed, giving off an exceptionally cold feeling. He followed the golden chain on his watch, took out a pocket watch of the same color, pressed it open to take a look, and then he said in a deep voice,
"Look at me."
The man in the cap didn't dare to disobey as he raised his head and looked in front of him.
"Yes, Mr. Harras."
Before he could finish his words, he saw a pair of eyes that flickered with a strange light, and he heard a command.
Maintain secrecy. You can't leak anything you see or hear in this villa to anyone else.
The man in the cap trembled inexplicably, feeling that he had to do as the other party had ordered. He lowered his head again and said,
"Yes, Mr. Harras."
The man in the cap carried an unconscious girl along the stairs to the entrance of the basement. There was a small room that was separated from the others, and a bearded man with an unknown age was sitting inside it. This bearded man had a pair of frighteningly cold blue eyes. He held a thin piece of flannel in his hand and was carefully cleaning the grayish-white rifle on the table. The rifle was thick and long, connected through a pipe to a large mechanical box of the same color. It was a high-pressure steam rifle. That was a military-controlled item.
"Mr. Belize."
The man in the cap entered a neatly arranged underground structure which resembled a prison. He then locked the unconscious girl in one of the small rooms. He locked the door, returned to the corridor, and picked up the lantern he had been assigned. At that moment, he saw a figure slowly approaching from the other end of the corridor. The figure seemed to be able to see through the darkness without any lighting. With the aid of the lantern, the man in the cap realized that it was a woman in her 30s. The woman was wearing a brown bonnet, a thin white blouse, and suspenders, as well as leather boots that reached her knees. There were old scars on her face and a cruel smile at the corners of her mouth. The man in the cap lowered his head in fear as he stammered,
Ma'am Katie?
The woman ignored him. Step by step, she approached him and walked past him, as though he was nothing more than air. When the lady named Katie had left, the man in the cap curled his lips and said,
Bitch, when you get into bed, you'll definitely be more energetic than a prostitute.
The man in the cap met two men in the grand hall that shimmered gold. One of them was about 1.65 meters tall, and he was a little plump. He didn't have any special features, but his eyes always had a frightening look. The other was slightly taller than 1.70 meters, and he looked a bit old. He had some wrinkles and a high nose bridge. His brown eyes were filled with spirit, and he didn't seem to have a look of deterrence.
Mr. Capim.
The man in the cap greeted the plump, middle-aged man. Then he said to another person,
Mr. Parker.
In the early light of dawn, the man in the cap met the cold, middle-aged gentleman called Mr. Harras at the entrance to the basement. Harras, wearing a white wig, glanced at him, who was standing respectfully by the side. He indifferently stretched out his right palm towards the entrance of the basement and solemnly said,
Confinement.
There are a total of 4 beyonders. At least 4 of them. The strongest should be that Mr. Harras, a sequence 6 at the very least, or maybe even sequence 5. I wonder what pathway it is. It does seem similar to the Black Emperor pathway. Relying on order and issuing commands? Judging from the scenes just now, the restrictions pertain only to the basement, not the entire villa. That's right. With so many people coming and going during the day, it would be too troublesome to enter and exit once the restrictions are in place. I wonder if it's the same at night.
Klein analyzed the information he had just received and asked again.
What's the overall layout of the villa?
He quickly received feedback and saw a magnificent hall, a wide dining room, connected corridors, washrooms, and scenes of the basement. Through them, Klein pieced together in his mind the rough layout of Capim's villa. Feeling the drain on his spirituality, he asked a final question.
Who are the important figures whom Capim is closely related to?
The scene in front of his eyes was the magnificent hall from before. Half-naked girls were prostrating themselves while serving the guests drinks, letting them abuse them or fool around with them. Otherwise, they were being dragged directly to a secluded spot to be ravaged. They were young, and their faces were bitter and numb. Any slight delay or lack of enthusiasm would result in them being whipped by Capim's attendants or maidservants. None of these servants showed a shred of sympathy despite seeing such evil scenes. They fought to be the first to showcase themselves in a bid to obtain rewards. Klein saw Capim among the guests, the cold Mr. Harras, and a member of Parliament from the House of Commons, who often appeared in the newspapers, Vardera, a fat man who was addressed as Deputy Chief.
Is that one of the deputy chiefs of the Backland Police Department? That's one of the higher-ups of the police department. To think that not a single one of those servants are good, that's understandable. The villa's hired personnel must have been screened before and would have to be sufficiently trustworthy.
Klein rubbed his forehead, halting the secret deed ritual. The man in the cap was only an inconsequential leader, and that was all he could know or participate in. Even at this moment, the mysterious restriction on him was still unperturbed. Klein ended the ritual and allowed him to vanish from above the gray fog as he returned to the real world. He sat by the bed and looked at the man in the cap who was unconscious. According to the information he had just gathered, he analyzed the feasibility of a performance and considered one plan after another. In the end, Klein came up with a definite idea. He whispered to himself,
Perhaps I don't need a helper. A helper would drag me down instead, making it inconvenient for me to escape in times of danger. Picking the right time is very important.
Nearly 50 minutes later, the man in the blackish-gray cap appeared in East Borough as he headed straight for the streets controlled by the Zemanger gang. As soon as he saw a few dark-skinned, lean people with ferocious looks, he immediately went close. Pretending to not watch where he was going, he bumped into one of them.
Damn it! You bunch of trash!
The man in the cap cursed loudly and punched at one of them. Highlanders who loved to fight didn't back down and entered a brawl with him. In the process, the man in the cap pulled out his dagger, and the other Highlanders also drew their weapons. Slash! During the battle, a dagger stabbed into the capped man's neck as he failed to dodge in time. It went right into his arteries. The man in the cap fell as red blood pooled around his head. He quickly lost his life, and the illusory, transparent figure within his body immediately vanished. Klein returned above the gray fog, and using it as a springboard, he re-entered his body. He then opened his eyes in the cheap hotel in Sherwood Borough. He cleaned up the rest of the evidence and went to the front desk to check out of the room. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein once again went above the gray fog. He wanted to divine a simple but crucial piece of information. He picked up a fountain pen and wrote down a line of text. Capim's dinner time today. Chapter 377, Capim's dinner. Putting down his dark red fountain pen, Klein picked up the piece of paper with the divination statement and leaned back in his chair. His lips moved as he whispered, Capim's dinner time today, over and over again. Klein's voice echoed above the empty gray fog as his eyes rapidly turned dark, and his eyelids drooped. In a fragmented dreamscape, he saw the spacious, elegant dining room where there was gilded porcelain cutlery, caviar, roasted chicken, lamb stew, fried rib-eye steak, deep-fried dragon-bone fish, thick, creamy soup, and so on. The food was placed in a certain order, according to specific requests in front of several diners. Among them was the slightly plump Capim, the middle-aged gentleman in a white wig, Harras, the thin-bloused Katie, and Parker, whose face was rather unintimidating due to his old age. Looking out from the end of the dining table, he could see a window decorated with gorgeous decorations. Outside the window, the clouds were sparse, and the crimson moon was faintly discernible in the air. Klein opened his eyes and marked the location of the moon in his dream. Using his knowledge in astromancy, he quickly calculated a rough corresponding time.
It looks like it's from 7:30 to 7:45 in the evening. Considering those few scenes, Capim and the others have already finished more than half their meals, so I can push the time back by another 15 minutes. That way, 7:30 is the best choice.
Klein muttered silently to himself as he interpreted the revelation from his dream divination. Eating at 7:30 was not a rare occurrence. This was even considered mainstream in the Lowen Kingdom and even the northern continent, because many middle-class people, either due to their personal situations or because of low rent, lived in the suburbs and had to commute to work by taking the short-distance steam locomotive. By the time they got home, it was usually after 7 in the evening, so it was normal for people to have dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Klein had had the same experience in Tianjin City, but that was because he had no servants and no housewife. Once the three siblings returned home, they still needed to busy themselves for quite a while before they could enjoy any hot food. It wasn't because they lived far from work. This was why civilians and the poor often had dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. As lunch and dinner were separated by quite some time, afternoon tea, which should have belonged to the upper-class citizens, became popular among the middle-class citizens and civilians. When he finished the interpretation, Klein recalled the revelation he had just received. Klein became acutely aware of a problem.
Where were Capim's wife and children? They didn't appear in the dining room. Is Capim an extreme believer in the Lord of Storms, so his wife and children have to eat their meals in the activity room? Or is there another reason? Or could he be unmarried and childless? He's already a middle-aged man.
Klein tried to divine the situation, but he failed to receive any effective revelations, so he gave up. 7:30. He repeated the time once more before returning to the real world. In the evening, even at home, Capim, who was wearing a formal bow tie, narrowed his eyes and looked at his subordinates before him. He asked in a slow but chilling voice,
Fabian is dead?
Yes, boss.
Even though he had been working with Capim for many years, his subordinates still felt fear and horror.
Odysseus? Call me Mr. In a few years, you'll have to call me Sir Capim.
Capim loosened his bow tie and casually handled a thick cigar.
When did Fabian die? How did he die?
This afternoon, I sent him to Eastborough to do something. He ended up in a conflict with the Zeemanger gang and got stabbed in the neck.
Odysseus described in a trembling voice. Capim, who was toasting the cigar, said in an unperturbed tone,
Fabian is really a fool. But are the people from the Zeemanger gang unaware that he's my idiotic subordinate?
Mister, as you know, Highlanders often join the Zeemanger gang when they arrive in East Borough, and they're barbaric and reckless, and they don't give a shit who's who.
Odysseus quickly explained. Capim snorted.
Have they forgotten that this isn't the Highlands? Or have they forgotten who I am? Odysseus, I want the body of the Zeemanger gang's leader from that block. Can you do it? If you can't, I'll sink your wife, your child, as well as you, into the Tussock River.
Mister, no problem.
Odysseus immediately raised his voice. He immediately asked in a low voice,
Who can I mobilize?
Capim was about to reply when the door suddenly opened and the middle-aged gentleman with a white wig, Harras, walked in. He gave Odysseus a cold glance before casting his gaze onto Capim.
I heard that one of your subordinates had a conflict with a gang in East Borough and ended up dying?
Yes, Mr. Harras.
Capim stood up, cigar in hand. Harras stared into Capim's eyes and said,
You want revenge on them?
Capim's forehead suddenly dripped with beads of sweat.
No, not at all. Mr. Harras, you misunderstand.
Harras nodded slightly.
You have to remember that during this critical period, we have to try our best to not cause any trouble unless necessary.
He paused for a second and observed Capim's reaction.
You are not the only human trafficker in Backland. We can support you, but we can also do so for others. You have to remember this point. The reason why I picked you was because you were vicious and shameless enough. However, you were extremely cautious. It wasn't because you were the biggest human trafficker.
From the side, Odysseus listened to the duo's conversation. He wished that he was just a mass of air. That way, he didn't need to see how humble his boss Capim was. Without a trace of anger on his face, Capim smiled and said,
Mr. Harras, my main concern is that Fabian's death isn't simple. It might disrupt your plans.
No, there's nothing wrong with his death.
Harras said in an affirmative tone.
I didn't get any feedback.
Is that so?
Capim acted enlightened.
Then I'm relieved.
He looked at Odysseus and signaled him to leave. He then lowered his voice and said,
Mr. Harras, this time they're the kind of goods you like from this batch?
Seeing Haras's expression soften but not show any signs of emotion, Capim quickly added,
We've already finished gathering the ones that will be sent over.
Harras nodded slowly.
Send her to my room tonight.
Yes, Mr. Harras.
Capim said with a big smile. After Harras left, his face turned gloomy. He took a deep breath and whispered,
I hope that you can keep your promise this time. I don't want to be involved in anything like that anymore.
He clearly remembered that year during the Harvest Festival. Someone had come to him, hoping to get a batch of innocent girls. From that day on, the trajectory of his life had undergone tremendous changes. He had taken a fifth of the market share of the unlawful slave trade. He quickly became one of Backland's rather famous tycoons, acquainting himself with several important figures and dragging them into the abyss of depravity. At this point, he desperately wanted to cover up the sins of his past. He wanted to let Capim undergo a catharsis, allowing him to become a true member of the upper class. However, for the time being, he was unable to do so. Glancing at the cigar in his hand, he picked up the framed photograph of himself with a beautiful woman and 2 children. Rubbing the surface of the photo frame with his thumb, Capim narrowed his eyes and whispered to himself,
After this deal, you should be able to return.
At dinner time, Capim walked out of his study. A warm smile plastered over his face again.
Ma'am, Katie, there's your favorite caviar and a roast chicken specially prepared for you this evening.
He said to the woman in the thin blouse.
Katie touched the old scar on her face and nodded without saying a word.
Capim knew that she was silent and fierce, so he didn't continue. He watched her as she took her seat. Then Harras, wearing a white wig, entered the dining room, nodding slightly to each of the diners. The elderly Parker took a sip of his pre-meal wine, smiling as he motioned for Capim to sit down. The white napkins were spread out, and the food was served one by one. Capim raised his glass and chuckled.
Holy Lord of Storms, let's toast to a beautiful future.
To a beautiful future,
Parker responded. Harras didn't say a word. He merely held the wine glass in his hand and made a gesture. Katie completely ignored them. At this moment, the classical clock hanging in the hall read 7:23. In a cheap hotel in the Backland Bridge area, the disguised Klein took out his golden pocket watch, looked at the exact time. Then he took out holy night powder, and he sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. After doing that, he quickly set up an altar and conducted a ritual.
I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck.
When the ritual was over, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog, ready to respond to himself. Inside the towering and solemn palace, he saw the door of summoning condensed by rippling light. It was a pair of illusory doors that opened outwards, covered with mysterious symbols. Klein was in no hurry to be summoned. Instead, he took out the sun brooch and other mystical items, and he absorbed them into his spirit body according to his plan. Finally, he picked up the Black Emperor card and let his spirit body envelop it. All of a sudden, Klein felt as if his spirit body had turned corporeal with flesh and blood. It was as if he could lift a gun and move a table and chair. A dark and ethereal mist rose up around him, and as the mist clung onto the surface of his body, it formed an imposing set of armor. He had a black crown on his head and a long cape of the same color on his back. At that moment, Klein was like an emperor about to embark on a journey. Black Emperor. He examined the purifying bullets and revolver that he didn't bring with him before taking a step forward and entering the crack on the illusory door. Leaping out of the candlelight, he immediately flew under the cover of the night towards Capim's villa on Iris Street in Cherwood Borough. Not long after, he floated in front of the artificial fountain and approached the villa's entrance at a relaxed pace. The patrolling guards passed by him, but they didn't have any reaction. Since it wasn't really late into the night yet, there were no beyonders on guard outside. In addition, Klein wasn't afraid that the powerful beyonders inside would notice and have a premonition. It was because the Black Emperor card possessed anti-divination and anti-prophecy characteristics. Chapter 378, The Show Begins. With a black crown and a solid suit of armor, Klein stood in the doorway, attuned himself for a few seconds, and took a step forward. His seemingly physical body silently passed through the door and entered Capim's villa. The first thing that met him was a spacious hall, with lots of chairs and clothes racks, and behind it was a magnificent hall with gold as the main color theme. There was no ceiling, only a dome reaching 3 stories high. A giant crystal chandelier hung down, and on each petal was a pearly white candle. Through a thick, heavy door to the left of the hall was an elegant and exquisite dining room. The fragrance of roasted meat was the richest inside, concealing the smell of alcohol and other food. Klein was in no hurry to enter the dining room. He partially circled the exterior first, occasionally reaching out his hand to pull on the grayish-white gas pipes. It appeared as if he was experimenting with his physical strength after carrying the Black Emperor card to see how much of an impact he had on the real world. While he was a seer and clown, Klein's spirit body only had an intuition ability that was separate from divination. He possessed only 2 spell-like powers, which were to directly attack the soul and to freeze the target through contact. Once he advanced to the magician's sequence, even if Klein didn't rely on the beyonder powers of his physical body, he could still use paper figurine substitutes and air bullets in his spirit body state. In addition, he began to be able to possess others and gain basic control of the target. Augmented by the Black Emperor card, the strength of his spirit body increased, and the number of items he could carry increased. His spell-like powers, which could directly attack souls, evolved into a specter's shriek. It produced sound waves that were inaudible to humans, but capable of damaging the souls of all living beings in the area, also known as soul bodies. Similarly, the frozen effects derived from contact was clearly strengthened. After confirming everything, he found the corner of a wall and penetrated it to enter the dining hall. Then, suppressing all his emotions, he swept his eyes across the long table. The scene of Harras in his white wig, Katie in her thin blouse, Parker with his aged face drinking red wine, and the slightly plump Capim slicing his ribeye steak caught his eye. Klein retracted his gaze quickly, not daring to look too much, lest the few beyonders would discover him via their spiritual perception. With the help of the spiritual glows from the male and female servants standing around him, that is, the color of their auras, he carefully circled around the dining room and figured out the exact layout. For example, the size of the dining room was equivalent to the total area of his living room, dining room, and activity room. Another example was that there was a fireplace that burned with charcoal. It warmed the entire room via a pipe. There were 16 elegant gas lamps, and their lighting mixed together, making the room appear like it was daytime. Across from the fireplace was a wall which had hanging picture frames. There were sketches and oil paintings, all works of famous artists.
That bearded Belize isn't here. He should be changing shifts at the basement. For a Beyonder to be willing to do such menial work, Capim is definitely not involved in the simple matter of human trafficking.
Klein thought for a few seconds, then he leaned against an oil painting of the sunset. He reached his hand into his body and unscrewed a translucent brown bottle's cap. It was the biological poison bottle. The reason why he paid so much attention to the time and chose to arrive at dinner time was because, at this very moment, the main figures were gathered here in the most orderly manner. It was the most advantageous for him to use the biological poison bottle. And with the tightly shut doors and windows during early winter, it allowed the effects of biological poison bottle to be more effective and have faster effects. In addition, Klein didn't soak the biological poison bottle to concoct the prophylactic drug before he came. He was currently in his spirit body state, so he wasn't afraid of biological poisons. With his spirit body's concealment and containment, he stood there silently and patiently, admiring each and every one of the elegant wall lamps which were connected to the grayish-white gas pipes. Quickly, the odorless poison swiftly emanated outwards. Harras, with his white wig, sliced up a deep-fried dragon bone fish, dipped it in black pepper sauce, and stuffed it into his mouth. Chewing and swallowing, he picked up the faintly golden champagne that was bubbling like a string of beads, and took a sip in a good mood. He couldn't help but think of the entertainment that he would be experiencing that evening, the joy of a stubborn girl being conquered by him. This affected his appetite and made him unable to concentrate. Katie didn't get the servant to help her slice the roasted chicken. She was burying her head, holding a knife and fork, and like doing a precise dissection, she quickly divided the chicken into several pieces. They were all almost the same size. As Parker sampled the red wine and ate the stewed lamb, he would occasionally chat with Capim, who was sitting at the head of the table and was considered as a guest that didn't sully the title. The dinner proceeded in an orderly manner, and finally Capim put the last piece of beef into his mouth. Akana. He smiled at the three Beyonders and said,
Mr. Harras, Ma'am Katie, and Mr. Parker, tonight's desserts are from La Borega's head chef. There are 3 kinds: fruit, caramel pudding, cream shortcake, and the carrot cake.
Harras, who had always been cold, nodded slightly.
We love dessert so much in this country.
As soon as he finished his reflection, he saw Capim raise his hand and scratch his cheek before scratching again.
That's a little itchy?
Capim smiled apologetically. Before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't help but scratch one more time, leaving a clear bloody mark on his face. The bloody mark quickly swelled up, and his skin turned translucent. One could even see yellowish pus inside.
It's really a bit itchy.
Capim smiled again. He scratched the original spot again, but due to using excessive force, the swelling caused the translucent skin to split open, and pus with a nauseating smell sprayed out. Harras narrowed his eyes and shot to his feet, looking around warily.
Ha ha! Ha ha! Ha ha!
At that moment, he heard exaggerated laughter, and his body suddenly tensed up. He saw a male and female servant holding onto their bellies, laughing out loud. They laughed so much that they couldn't even straighten their backs. Tears flowed out from their laughter. Their laughter caused the room to turn completely silent. Like a chain reaction, the rest of the servants fainted or vomited yellow-green liquid continuously without end. None of them were spared. Bam! Katie flipped the dining table, letting the gold-plated cutlery and leftover food and wine to spill onto the floor. She had a revolver and a soft black whip in her hands. Parker stood up as well, but his mind appeared adrift. He looked at Capim, crying miserably for help as he kept scratching and forcefully tore off a few pieces of flesh. For some baffling reason, he felt that the other party's ugly and disgusting appearance was quite the fine sight. At that moment, Harras realized that he was a little out of breath and realized that the room was probably filled with poison. Hoof, he growled.
Hold your breath. Parker, open the door. Katie, follow me to find the intruder.
At this moment, Harras was grateful that the dinner had been enjoyed with Capim, and there were quite a few attendants around. These ordinary people's ability to resist poison was far inferior to Beyonders. The fact that they showed signs ahead of time had allowed them to detect that something was amiss even before the poison had reached the deepest part of their bodies.
Parker, who has the lowest sequence, should be the one with the most severe symptoms among us.
Harras suddenly had this thought. Creak. As Parker opened the door to ensure that the dining room was no longer sealed, Harras, relying on his spirit vision, discovered an illusory figure quietly fleeting around. The figure wore a thick and imposing black armor and a pitch-black crown on his head. A mask of the same color covered his face, making him look like a king from the spirit world. How? It was none other than Klein. Harras raised his right hand and pointed at the black figure that couldn't be seen by ordinary people. He chanted in ancient Hermes.
In prison.
All of a sudden, the black figure's surroundings turned viscous, as though it had transformed into a giant amber or produced a sealed, transparent wall. The figure was rooted to the spot, hardly able to move. Katie had taken aim long ago, and she pulled the trigger. They worked well together. With two bangs, the light golden bullet, filled with strange patterns, penetrated the viscous air and hit the black figure. The bullet pierced through and struck the wall opposite. The black shadow, self-ignited, reduced to a roughly cut paper figurine. Within the pale golden flames, the paper figurine was quickly reduced to ashes. Pa! With a strange, crisp snap, the light from the 16 elegant gas lamps and the fire burning quietly in the fireplace suddenly lit up, leaving Harras, Katie, and Parker with only a brief flash of red before their eyes. Soon after, all the flames were extinguished, leaving the dining room illuminated via the human height street lamps outside the window and the crimson moonlight shining through the layers of clouds. It made the place abnormally dark and silent. Harras and the others once again relied on their spirit vision and spiritual perception to search for the ghostly intruder. At the same time, he realized that the poison wasn't showing its effects fast enough. It wouldn't really flare up until he finished the enemy. Therefore, he paid attention to the movement at the entrance of the basement. He pointed at the door again and said in ancient Hermes,
Confinement.
The entire dining room suddenly froze, as if there was an additional layer of an invisible wall that even spirit bodies couldn't penetrate. Harras wanted to make it impossible for the intruder to escape.
I've found you.
Wielding the revolver in one hand and the whip in the other, Katie noticed a black figure floating in the air. A strange light flashed in her eyes, and before she could attack, her mind buzzed as if someone had struck her head with a wooden stick. She felt as if she had encountered an indescribable shriek. A few drops of sticky blood slowly dripped from the tip of her nose. Harras only felt slight dizziness, while the symptoms of shortness of breath seemed to worsen. Parker, the weakest of them, was seeing stars, and his steps became unstable. Suddenly, someone patted Parker's shoulder. A cold and gloomy feeling gushed over, causing him to freeze on the spot. It was as if he was completely covered in ice, and the cold moisture seeped into his bones. A familiar, deep voice sounded in his ears.
In prison.
Parker was instantly trapped by the transparent wall that imprisoned the door. However, Klein didn't possess him and went straight through instead, avoiding the effects of Harras's spell in a timely manner. Harras narrowed his eyes and waved his right hand.
Release.
Chapter 379, Magic's Key Segment. The invisible prison around Parker's body immediately collapsed, leaving not even a single trace of it behind. However, he didn't regain his mobility. Instead, he slumped to the ground, shivering continuously, as if he was still frozen. This wasn't only an after effect of soul touch, but also the effect of Klein's direct attack on his soul. Parker, who was only a Sequence 8, was unable to recover in a short period of time. He couldn't even control his breathing and, as a result, inhaled large quantities of the biological poison, which was identical to the one in his body once again. His weakened state caused the poison in his body to act faster. His eyes stared blankly as he instinctively changed direction. He saw Capim rolling on the ground and scratching his face and body constantly. He saw the thin strips of flesh hanging by the side of the wounds and the ghostly white color of his bones. Parker gasped and struggled to climb over. Capim, whose itch made him rip off the outer layer of his skin, suddenly discovered that Parker was crawling toward him with bloodshot eyes. He had a bad premonition, but he had no strength to dodge as he couldn't stop scratching. He didn't even have the ability to shout no, except for using a blood-curdling cry as a substitute. At this moment, Klein, who had dodged the imprison spell, shouted holy in ancient Hermes. Then he rubbed his fingers together and shot an air bullet through the dark golden sunbird brooch's coruscating glow. As soon as the air bullet was formed, it took on a holy luster and shot straight towards Harras's face. This was the holy oath provided by the sun brooch, and Klein had augmented the air bullet with holy damage. Harras had long since changed his position. He was abnormally agile, and unlike a mage, he was more like a pugilist expert. As he avoided Klein's air bullet, he motioned for Katie to lash her whip to hold Klein back. When Klein's attack was interrupted, Harras took an iron-black metal glove from a hidden pocket of his and tried to put it on his left hand. In his spirit body state, Klein didn't need to look out from the corner of his eye to see what had just happened despite not facing Harras. He immediately flew up, avoiding Katie's lash. He flew over the chandelier and pounced towards Harras. When Harras saw this scene, he held the black metal glove and pointed diagonally upwards.
Exile.
Klein was suddenly hit by an overwhelming and invisible force. His entire spirit body was blown away by the wind and hit the wall conjured by confinement, but didn't penetrate through it and escape. Seizing this opportunity, Harras put on the iron black metal glove. In the blink of an eye, he seemed to grow a bit taller. His authority was uplifted, like he was a figure that could determine the life and death of others. The moment Klein was released from the exile state, he felt an inexplicable sense of horror. He couldn't help but want to lower his head, to prostrate, to listen to Harras's every word and obey every order given by him. His movements had become sluggish, and his pupils reflected a rapidly approaching Katie. Pah! Katie lashed out with her long black whip and hit Klein accurately. The long whip passed through his spirit body, but it brought a great deal of pain to Klein's psyche, as if someone had pressed a red-hot iron to the weakest part of his body. He jerked his head up and let out a scream. As for Katie, she pulled the trigger of the revolver in her other hand. Bang! Bang! 2 bullets, with a light golden glow, shot out one after another, striking Klein's body. Bright rays of light bloomed, and the figure wearing black armor rapidly thinned, turning into a paper figurine and quickly burning into ashes. Klein appeared in a dark corner. The sun brooch inside his spirit body was glowing with a dark golden light. Warm powers instantly filled his body, and the extreme horror that Harras had subjected him to quickly disappeared. One of the spell-like effects of the sun brooch was horror immunity. In the short span of less than a minute, Klein had already been forced to use paper figurine substitutes twice. Although it was partly because he did it on purpose, it was still enough to prove the strength of Harras and Katie's joint attacks. It was enough to confirm the divination outcome which Klein had received. This operation would be quite dangerous. If Parker hadn't been temporarily crippled by the effects of the biological poison bottle and his initial surprise attack, the situation would have been even more dangerous. His plan was to rationally give up if all 4 paper figurines were used up, and his opportunity had yet to appear. It wasn't because Klein didn't wish to prepare more substitutes, but because his spirituality could only afford 4 times while in combat. As for the confinement effect that Harras had created, Klein wasn't worried at all. He was now a spirit body that had been summoned. As long as he ended the summoning, he would immediately return above the gray fog. Unless it was intercepted by powers at the level of deities or the special effects of sealed artifacts at grade 0 or grade 1, nothing could interrupt this process. Previously, when Klein went to the Royal Museum to steal the Black Emperor card, the woman who was suspected of being a high-sequence beyonder was unable to stop him from leaving. This was the main reason why Klein dared to challenge the impossible even though he knew that the danger was great. Seeing that the enemy was no longer horrified, Harras put on his black metal gloves and signaled Katie to hold Klein back. He then pointed forward and solemnly said,
Specters and wraiths are prohibited here.
Klein's body, that was covered in black armor, immediately trembled as he was strongly repelled by a powerful, invisible force. However, the level of the Black Emperor card was extremely high, causing the level of the spirit body to be relatively high as well. This kind of influence that was directly aimed at a particular existence was quickly suppressed. Harras narrowed his eyes, feeling that the intruding specter was very strange. He saw that Klein easily escaped Katie's intervention via flight, so he pushed his palm forward again and announced in ancient Hermes,
Flying and floating are prohibited here.
All of a sudden, Klein felt his body become heavy, and he plummeted from midair to the ground. Katie quickly rushed over, and with a flick of her wrist, she lashed out with the whip that directed torture on the mind and soul. She still had many Beyonder bullets on her, but there were fewer than 3 that were targeted for specters and wraiths. Therefore, she temporarily gave up on using the revolver and only relied on her auxiliary weapon. Klein rolled on the ground, skillfully dodging Katie's whip. He heard the crack of the whip as it hit the ground. Katie was about to sweep the whip when she felt an itch at her throat. She coughed twice and missed the opportunity to continue her relentless attack. This was a sign of the poison acting up. Harras took a deep breath, held his breath once more. He folded his wrist, pointed to himself, and said,
Disciplinary target, wraiths and specters.
The surface of his body immediately emitted a light as bright as the morning sun. Even his fist began to shine with lustrous brilliances. Bam! The marble under Harras's feet cracked soundlessly, and his tall, thin body pounced swiftly and fiercely, allowing him to immediately close in on Klein. At this moment, he looked even more like a knight than Katie. Bam! He threw a punch forward, and the air seemed to explode. However, Klein had pulled back ahead of time, dodging the punch with the wind. Pow! Katie helped from the side and lashed out with her whip in the direction in which her enemy was dodging. This forced Klein to have no choice but to roll again and again. He took on a fighting stance while keeping an eye out for Harras's spell-like in prison. As lashing sounds echoed, Harras kept attacking while Katie aided him from the side. In less than 2 minutes, Klein was forced into an unavoidable situation. Even rolling was of no use. Pah! Katie's black whip lashed out at Klein's face, and he was only able to take 1 step sideways before being hit in the arm. That piercing pain attacked his psyche once again, causing him to freeze on the spot. Even his spirit body became somewhat thinner. Seizing this opportunity, Harras clenched his left fist and solemnly declared,
Death.
His body then merged with some sort of strange force, creating an obvious afterimage as he slammed into Klein. Schwing! The figure covered in black armor instantly broke into pieces, turning into pieces of paper that fluttered in the air like a butterfly. Klein had expended his 3rd paper figurine. Harras's gaze swept across the room and quickly locked onto the enemy that had appeared in the corner. He sneered and said,
Let me see how many substitutes you have left.
In the process of searching for the enemy, he discovered that Parker was squirming on top of Capim. The scene was bloody and disgusting. It was a repulsive sight, both terrible and horrifying. However, Harras didn't have the luxury of time to save his subordinate. He was well aware that the effects of the poison would only worsen over time, so he had to get rid of the enemy as quickly as possible so he couldn't be distracted. If he didn't, he would have to leave the dining hall first to recover from the poison, thus allowing the enemy to escape without getting any useful information. He signaled Katie to go forward again, so as to hold back Klein, who couldn't fly or float. He took a breath and tried to catch a breather. This thought flashed through Harras's mind, but he didn't think too much about it.
There's a strange smell in the air. This is probably a result of the increasing toxicity of the poison.
He raised his left hand and solemnly declared,
The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime, an illegal intrusion.
While repeating the statement for a second time, Harras found it hard to breathe again. For a moment, he was unable to catch his breath, so he could only stop midway. He took another deep breath, adjusted himself, and spoke again.
The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime.
He repeated it 3 times, and Klein, who was still unable to extricate himself from Katie's entanglement, felt a baffling chill. Cough, cough, cough. Katie showed coughing symptoms again, and the flailing of her whip became sluggish. Klein took the opportunity to stop the embroilment with her, but he didn't attack her. Instead, he raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a sharp cry that no human could hear. Hum! Katie's head jerked up, and her body swayed. She felt like the ground was bobbing up and down. Harras only felt a slight dizziness before returning to normal. He looked at Klein coldly and said in a majestic voice,
The guilty should be restricted.
Klein, who was lunging at him, found to his surprise that his feet had seemed to be immobilized by invisible shackles. It made his movements suddenly turn rigid. Katie, who had recovered a little, swung open the revolver's cylinder and quickly removed the spent and unused rounds. Then, she took out a quick reloading device and stuffed 6 rounds of ammunition, including her remaining purifying bullets, into the cylinder. Harras clenched his left fist and prepared for an attack. He wanted to chain his attack with Katie's shooting, in a bid to completely finish the enemy or to expend his substitutes. At this moment, the black-armored Klein smiled. It was because the opportunity he had been waiting for had come. He knew that it would take time for the biological poison bottle to show any significant effects. And once Beyonders sensed that something was wrong, they would act accordingly, either to find the hidden enemy or to escape the toxic environment. It would be difficult to seriously damage them or even finish them. Therefore, he had 2 other reasons for using the biological poison bottle. The first reason was to weaken the enemy. The second reason was to mask some smell so that Harras and the others would attribute all the abnormal smells they detected to the poison in the air. It made them focus all their attention on this aspect. This was the most important segment of a magic show, and also the key to success or failure. That abnormal smell was the smell of gas. The reason why Klein let the gas lamp in the fireplace suddenly brighten and extinguish wasn't solely to affect Harras and Company's vision. It was mainly to attract their attention so that he could destroy a few hidden gas pipes. In the beginning, he had intentionally put himself in danger in order to trick Katie into firing a bullet meant for wraiths and specters, so that she would no longer blindly fire at him and not trigger a corresponding explosion. He kept entangling himself with her and hadn't made any other attempts solely because he was waiting for the air to be filled with gas. Therefore, he kept holding back from using flaming jump or flame controlling. As for Harras's actions of using confinement on the room, he had expected it, but he didn't expect it to be this successful. Therefore, before he entered the dining room, he had kindly inspected the doors and windows to see if they were airtight. He had destroyed the hidden gas pipes in the hall, causing the area, both inside and outside, to become a huge bomb. Even without confinement, it would ultimately not affect anything. As a specter, Klein was undoubtedly unafraid of explosions. Lower-level ghosts might be annihilated by fire, but specters would at most suffer some damage. This was why Klein had to buy extra purifying bullets and the sun brooch despite the fact that he had flame controlling. When he saw that Katie had raised her revolver and was about to shoot, and that Harras was about to pronounce death on him, Klein smiled and snapped his fingers. Harras suddenly felt a dangerous foreboding. However, at this moment, he saw that a flame had already lit up in the fireplace to his side, instantly igniting the surrounding air. Boom! With a loud boom, Harras's vision was instantly filled with an inferno that filled the room. It was as if he was watching a grand display of fireworks. Chapter 380. Curtain Call. Capim lay flat on the ground, itching and aching, wishing he could tear himself apart on the spot to rid himself of this hellish pain. Then he saw a scarlet wave of fire that spread over in a flash, and he heard a deafening explosion. He imagined that this last moment would seem infinitely long and that it would allow him to recall all of the beautiful scenes when his wife and children were still by his side. He thought that he would feel relieved because he would no longer have to endure this inhuman torture. But at that moment, extreme fear and an intense desire to live surged from the bottom of his heart. And the so-called memories didn't even flash past his mind before he was overwhelmed by an excruciating pain before being plunged into deep darkness. Boom! The dining room windows were blasted apart, accompanied by countless brick fragments and rubble, as well as the burning tongues of fire that kept reaching outwards. The guards patrolling this area were immediately knocked over. Those who were lucky enough to not get hit had their ears left ringing. Their bodies either swayed, staggered, or fell. They saw that more than half of the dining room's outer wall had collapsed and that the flames seemed to be floating in midair. The residents of the entire street and the police officers in charge of the surrounding area heard a loud boom at the same time, leaving them confused and frightened. In the dining room, dressed in black armor and a black crown, Klein stood there, bathing in the red flames and enjoying the strong blasts of the waves without flinching. A lot of the black gases around him had dispersed, and even his spirit body had suffered some damage, but it wasn't serious at all. Beside a toppled table, Parker and Capim were blasted into a corner, their heads were cracking, and their bodies charred. The surface of their bodies was still quietly burning with flames, and the rest of the servants were in a similar state. In the area opposite the fireplace, Katie, who had been unable to avoid the attack in time, was slammed into the wall and then fell to the ground. Her body was mangled and covered in blood, and there were a lot of charred marks on her skin. Not a single piece of her skin remained intact. She wasn't dead yet, but she had fainted from her severe injuries. Even so, she still coughed while convulsing, inhaling large amounts of the lingering flames. The black whip also suffered similar damage. Many cracks appeared on its surface, and a small portion of the whip was ignited. None of the Beyonder bullets that she possessed were spared from the explosion. Katie was no longer capable of fighting. Harras had rolled in time to protect his vitals, but there was still a lot of blood and charred flesh on him. He staggered to his feet, revealing that his back, his hairband, and his legs were ablaze with red flames. His breathing became more difficult, and his body suffered relatively severe injuries. However, this was sufficient to prove the robustness and strength of his body. Or rather, having worn the black iron glove, his body became sufficiently robust, and his physique was sufficiently strong. However, this was within Klein's expectations. Since he was unable to assess how much damage his opponent could take, he had overestimated his enemy's constitution while coming up with a plan. Out of the corner of his eye, Harras saw that Klein was almost perfectly fine. His pupils shrank as he hurriedly stretched out his left hand and pointed in that direction. He said in a low voice,
Exile.
Again, Klein failed to resist and was pushed away like scrap paper in a hurricane. He flew out of the dining room. In the hall outside, after the momentary ignition, the fire had already weakened. Another wave of disaster was brewing due to the wooden staircase. But the damage here wasn't too severe because the main body of the explosion had been confined to the dining room. Seizing this opportunity, Harras suddenly turned around and ran outside without looking back. Even though the flames covering his body were still burning, he didn't waste any time to deal with them. He knew that he was in a terrible condition and on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, the effects of the poison would soon reach its peak. Compounded by these two factors, he didn't think that he had any chance of defeating the intruder. It would be the same even if he had the help of the Sequence 7 Belize at the entrance to the basement. Harras believed that if this battle continued, the only thing that awaited him was having the poison act up or him losing control due to his injuries. Once he decided to run, he didn't care about Katie, who was still alive, anymore. When Klein, who had just stabilized his body under exile, saw this scene, he immediately raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a shriek that no human could hear. Harras felt a wave of dizziness, and his feet paused for a moment. His skin, which was still in relatively good condition, was now covered in dense, translucent blisters. This was an early sign of him losing control. However, he quickly recovered and continued his mad dash, escaping from the lawn of the villa.
He's really hard to kill.
Klein didn't pursue him in order to avoid an accident. He remembered that his goal was to rescue the victims and not to wipe away these degenerate beyonders. More importantly, he had expended a lot of his energy and had suffered heavy injuries. If he were to give chase, he might not be able to stop Harras's berserk counterattack. Pah! Klein snapped his fingers and fired an air bullet. The bullet struck Katie in the head, ending her pain. Immediately following that, Klein turned around and flew towards the entrance to the basement. Belize, who had a full beard, had been keeping an eye on the situation outside, but he didn't dare to leave his post out of fear that the intruder's accomplices would take the opportunity to break into the dungeon. At this very moment, he held a high-pressure steam rifle and had his spirit vision activated. He had been frightened by the loud boom and became abnormally tense. Immediately afterwards, he saw the dignified specter fly over, and without hesitation, he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bang! White mist was ejected from the barrel, and a sharp-tipped pale gold bullet was shot forward at an astonishing speed. Klein was prepared and long had a hunch. He had drawn out a small curve before Belize fired. The bullet tore through the hall, past the front door, and to the outside. At the same time, Belize rushed out of the duty room, holding his high-pressure steam rifle, and took on a threatening pose as he quickly moved towards the door. He believed that the intruder, who could deal with Harras, Katie, and Parker, would be able to easily kill him as well. Besides, such a big commotion must have attracted a lot of attention. He couldn't be certain that the mandated punishers would come over to investigate. Therefore, his only choice was to flee. Klein once again let out an invisible shriek, making Belize feel as if he had been smashed by a hammer. He saw stars as a few drops of blood dripped from the tip of his nose. But this didn't stop Belize from running. After shooting at Klein to stop him, he was already running into the hall, tumbling towards the door. Klein hesitated for a moment. Then he gave up on chasing and fighting. He turned off the main valve, went to the entrance of the basement, and snapped his fingers repeatedly. Bang! 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 Air bullets shot at the invisible walls, gradually disintegrating the confinement. This was also one of the reasons why Klein dared to cause a gas explosion and use the biological poison bottle. With the effects of Harras's confinement in the underground dungeon, as long as it wasn't a frontal assault, he didn't have to worry about accidentally harming those pitiful girls. He destroyed the locks and flew into the dungeon, first finding the cell where Daisy had been held based on the revelation from his prior divination scenes. He then confirmed that she wasn't hurt too badly and was still able to move. Then his body turned illusory and melted into the metal door. Creak! 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 The iron doors on one side opened quickly, one after another, as though an invisible specter was running to unlock them. Creak! 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 After one side was done, he did it for the other side. Daisy and the other girls were frightened by the explosion outside. After a while, she was surprised to find that the door to her cell was open for some baffling reason. Yet no one entered. It felt like she could leave at any time. Some of the girls, who hadn't been disciplined at all since they were recently kidnapped, mustered their courage, got up, and attempted to run to the exit of the basement. They passed through the hall, which was slightly damaged by the explosion, and they left the burning villa's worsening condition, running faster and faster in the direction of freedom. When they reached the street, Daisy and the other girls thought to look back. Looking back, they could just barely make out an imposing figure standing upright on top of the evil building. It was clad in full black armor, and it wore a black crown. Whoosh! The cape behind the figure began to flutter silently. As they remembered the scene, they sought a nearby cathedral with their mistrust towards the police. When Klein returned to the smoky and burning dining room, he found that Parker's and Katie's beyonder characteristics had just begun to show signs of appearing. He checked the items they were carrying and confirmed that most of them had been destroyed. Even their money was charred to a crisp. Klein jumped up to the second and third floor, quickly checking for any relevant clues. He didn't attempt to use mediumship because he was short on time, and bringing them above the gray fog didn't meet the requirements of his curtain call. If even a minor leader was made to maintain secrecy, then these important figures would definitely have their own restrictions.
They aren't good candidates for performing mediumship as I please. Furthermore, the previous series of required actions is too troublesome, complicated, and inappropriate for the current situation that I'm in.
Klein ended his investigation with nothing to show for, but he picked up a deck of tarot cards. Returning to the destroyed, charred dining room, he took out all the major arcana cards from the tarot card deck and walked over to Capim's corpse. Then, he specially took 2 of them and scattered the rest over Capim's body. When this was done, he covered Capim's eyes with the 2 tarot cards he had specially drawn. They faced up with their main side. By this time, Parker's and Katie's beyonder characteristics had appeared. Tens of seconds later, an illusory door covered with complicated symbols appeared in midair outside the villa. The door opened without a sound, and from it, a handsome man in a crisp suit walked out. He looked to be in his 40s, mature and elegant. He had a pair of golden eyes, and with just one sweep of his face, he locked onto the dining room in the midst of the fire. At this moment, a strong gust of wind blew past, and a figure flew over at high speeds. Ewak! It was an old man wearing a soft hat. His silver eyes had an abnormal seriousness to them. He was wearing a black robe with the symbol of the Lord of Storms embroidered on it. It was none other than the Cardinal of the Church of Storms, the Archbishop of Backland, Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake. Ace asked in a deep voice,
"Why are you here?"
Any beyonder-related matters in Chairwood Borough came under the jurisdiction of the Holy Wind Cathedral, so he was entitled to ask. The handsome man's expression turned slightly nasty as he replied,
"I live nearby."
They were close to the West Borough. The 2 of them didn't speak any further. They landed on the ground at the same time and entered the explosion site. A violent hurricane churned and swept away the flames, sending them to the artificial fountain outside. The wind seemed to have a life and intelligence of its own. The 2 demigod figures then saw Katie, whose head was shot and her flesh charred black, and Parker, who was entangled with someone else while his head had caved in and cracked. They also saw Capim, who was covered in tarot cards, as well as the 2 major arcana cards on the face of the human trafficker. These were the Judgment card, which depicted an angel blowing a great trumpet, and the Emperor card, which was decked out in armor and was crowned. Almost at the same time, Cardinal Snake and the handsome man sensed something and turned their heads to look outside. They discovered a majestic figure in black armor and a black crown located at the top of the house by the side of the villa. The figure nodded slightly, and his cape was lifted. Then, without any warning, he disappeared right under the noses of the 2 high-sequence beyonders.